Welcome back to the Business Immigration Benchmark. I'm joined today with a very special guest, Liz Roscoe, Immigration and Mobility Manager at Whatnot. Liz and I are going to dig into all about what it takes to manage a growing program as a one-woman show, and not just a growing program in the U.S., but also around the globe. So without further ado, Liz, can you tell us about yourself, your background, and what you do for Whatnot?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, Laura. So, as you mentioned, I'm the Immigration and Mobility Manager at Whatnot, which is one of the fastest growing social marketplaces out there right now. And I've been at Whatnot for 2 years, still loving it. Prior to Whatnot, I was working at another tech startup, helping to build their immigration and global mobility program from the ground up as well. And then prior to that move in-house, I had about a decade of experience working in small boutique immigration law firms all the way up to your big four immigration law firms. And I think it's really that earlier part of my career that, gave me a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience to effectively move in-house when I did.
Amazing. Thanks for giving us that background. And I think some of our listeners are looking to understand how to make that jump from in-house. So we'll have to ask you more about that. But to get us started, tell me a little bit about the immigration and mobility program you're currently managing and, with the growth of the company, how you're handling that and what, best practices you have in place to stay efficient with so much work coming through your door.
Yeah. So the program at Whatnot is still relatively young, as the company is as well. But I'd say what's exciting is it's keeping pace with the level of growth that the company is seeing as well, which is great. And as Whatnot expands its global footprint, there's obviously new opportunities for different immigration support, as well as mobility needs that arise out of that. And these markets present new challenges, and therefore, sometimes require creative solutions while, still keeping things like compliance, front of mind. So like you said, right now it's a very small team, as in it's just me, myself, and I managing all of this. But I do work in close partnership with our vendors, including WR, which is essential for me on the day-to-day. I think in terms of best practices, when I think about the growth and the progression of the program, there are three main drivers I would say I keep top of mind. First, I mentioned it before, it's boring, but it's absolutely essential, is compliance, right? Just making sure we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's. Second, I would say is trying to build a world-class employee experience. Whether that's just a simple immigration case or it's, an international assignment, or sometimes those, overlap, and oftentimes it's both. I want our processes to be as smooth as possible for employees and as transparent as possible to make sure they feel supported and validated throughout the process. I think it's remiss to not be leading with empathy when we're helping employees to navigate these, complicated and stressful endeavors. So as someone who's experienced both, professionally and personally, the ups and downs of immigration and, moving to a new country, that's something that's always top of mind for me.
That's amazing. So I heard compliance, world-class sort of your internal customer experience, and then transparency and empathy. And, in all that, a smooth process. What would you say success looks like? And do you have any stories about like course correction when there's been, bumpiness for an employee or the employee's not having a good experience? I don't know if you've got any stories to share with like a success story or what you're always aiming for in sort of an anecdote versus, hey, when things went bumpy, here's what we did to course correct. Do you have any stories to share in either of those categories?
I don't know necessarily about a story in particular. What I would say, I think what I'm also driving towards while creating new like policies or new procedures is building in adaptability. So as a company that's young and as a company that moves extremely fast, things change really fast here and you have to keep up with that pace. So where I can build in adaptability often allows for us to be able to pivot, provide flexibility for the business itself, but also for the individual employee. So there's an element there of trying to find that balance of building a compliant and logical program, but also meeting the individual and meeting the business where they are right now.
Yeah, I like that adaptability. Another term I heard recently from another expert session and a guest I had on, instead of policy, they were sort of using guides. And to me, that kind of goes hand in hand. That term of guide feels more adaptable, more flexible. And that was kind of their intention that, like, the policy for them, they were finding they were making not necessarily exceptions, but it sounded like it just wasn't one size fits all. What it sounds like you're kind of discussing here, too, where it's like, hey, we need to be quick. The company's moving quick. And the environment we're operating in, we want to reflect that in the way they're servicing your foreign national employees. Does that sound right in the right ballpark?
Right on the nose. Honestly, I think I might actually steal the guide. I
Okay.
like that. I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah, sometimes policy I think is maybe a little bit too confining, or you're trying to build a policy that allows for so much flexibility that you're kind of like, where are the parameters around this? So I love that. Yeah, I think you hit that right on the head.
Yeah, I think that's something I'm going to explore more with, in-house folks of, and then what does a guide look like? Because policy definitely seems like really heavy compliance, which of course we have to be mindful of in a world where, especially with new administrations coming in 2025, regardless of whatever administration gets elected, we're going to see enforced compliance, whether that's with I-9, whether that's border security, whatever it might be. And the companies are going to be kind of in that mix and scrutinized with their immigration program. And policy feels like super scary, where guide feels like, okay, here, we've got some operating rules. Here's how we're going to do things, but situations comes up. And honestly, with a new administration and the way businesses work, like things are going to be really dynamic in 2025. And I think the flexibility, the adaptability that you're building into your program will provide that resiliency for you to operate, for your employees to get the benefits they need and move around the world, hopefully quickly, and be there when you need them to be there, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I guess, with that, what's top of mind for you? So you're obviously keeping, compliance, world-class service, transparency, and empathy in your program management. But are there issues you're wrestling with? What are you thinking about these days in Q4 of 2024?
So coming in, 2 years ago, there wasn't much of a program to speak of, right? So, the last 2 years, a lot of it has been, I'd say, structural work, right? You're trying to build your foundation. You're trying to build the company philosophy when it comes to a lot of these elements, and we're getting there. We're like very close, if not there, right? So I think now it's about listening. It's about listening to the business as my customer. It's about listening to my employees when they're on assignment or when they've gone through a permanent relocation, and really taking in that feedback and then iterating where it's possible. I'm realizing here and this was the same in my previous role at another company. When you're building from the ground up like this and you're moving so fast, you have to have low ego
Okay, I was
because
gonna
you
say,
could spend yeah you can spend months working on something that you think is a solution, and that this is going to fit and this is going to solve all our problems and it'll stick, and you have in your mind that it's got that scalability factor in there too for the long run, and then something changes, right? Then there's a pivot, whether that's external to whatnot or internal to whatnot, and you need to be able to let go of it, and you need to be able to say, okay, what here still stands true is being beneficial, and what do I need to let go of, and kind of like kill your darlings a little bit and say
yeah.
there's another solution out there that better fits us now.
Wow, what a sense of humility. Yeah, that is tough. Especially, when you're putting so much effort into it, building this beautiful, masterpiece, only to find out like, oh, actually, maybe that's not solving the problem for these employees or the business, or the problem changes, like you said, and
Yeah.
you have to sort of scrap it. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. That's a huge piece to the startup culture you're in. I love that. Stay humble, right? Okay, cool. Very cool. I'm no Kendrick, but it just popped in my head.
I loved it.
Thank you. Um, what are some challenges that you kind of talk about building and growth? So obviously that's a challenge. So talk to me about that and, diving into new jurisdictions outside the US and maybe outside of your wheelhouse. But in addition to growth, are you and your mobility program facing other challenges from business as usual or, growing the business?
I mean, I think that a lot of the challenges that we face is they're not terribly unique, I would say, probably to a lot of other, companies at this stage. I would say that, from the government side, changing regulations and uncertainty when it comes to immigration law is definitely something that's incredibly difficult. And I mean, you mentioned it before, but particularly looking at the US domestically, which is where the vast majority of, our foreign national population is, during an election year, there's a high level of uncertainty and fear that we experience as professionals in this space, but our impacted employees feel this 1,000 times over, right? So just trying to prepare for any changes we may experience while also allaying some of those doubts and those fears where we can becomes critical to supporting that foreign national population. Processing times remain an issue, whether you're in the US or you're looking at, a country abroad. It's almost like a universal issue in a lot of places. Significant backlogs on cases often, force us to make decisions that have impacts years out. And as a company
Right.
that's young and is quickly growing, that can often be difficult to navigate with internal stakeholders to one, just explain why we have to make those decisions early, and then be able to try to plan for what that impact is just by virtue of, this case is going to sit for years on end. And when it comes to fruition, these things still need to be true.
Do you find that you're in a position where almost like educating, coaching more often? Because a lot of these things you're describing, ultimately, whatnot vendors can't control. It's more just sort of coaching folks through the process and asking the business to make a decision based on the information we have today.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
think that's so much of what you have to do in-house
Yeah.
when looking at, the relationship between a company and their external vendors. Like WR, I rely on heavily and I consider them thought partners, right? As we move through things, of course. I also have experience and knowledge under my belt where I feel comfortable and I feel confident enough to be able to go into a room with folks in the business and be able to explain and say, look, this is why this is the way it is.
Yeah.
We don't love it. No
Yeah.
one loves it. There's very little, control in a lot of this that we have, but here's what we can control. And here are the options that we can pursue. And then try to be creative around what those options and those solutions are. So yeah, education is 100%. It's a massive piece, I would say, of what I have to do in-house.
Yeah. And then kind of translating, I suspect you probably hear from the business of like, okay, I didn't really understand any of that. Here's our objectives. And so you have to translate the objectives into like what the decision should be. Yeah, that could be really difficult because again, it's like based on the information you have now and then how that can change. Are you having like regular stakeholder meetings? I've never worked at a startup, so I don't really know what the culture is like. Do you have like stand-ups? Like how are you kind of updating stakeholders, to update these guides, policies, whatever we're calling them these days? How often are you meeting and updating leadership of the situation sort of globally and in the US from an immigration standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like, high level leadership. They're not in the weeds necessarily on
Or
all of it, but there's constant work and communication that's being done with my key stakeholders. If I'm working on trying to iterate on a process, let's say for instance, I'm going to need that feedback from my cross-functional partners
or
internally to make sure I'm not building something that's just in a silo and
yeah,
that isn't actually going to work in its reality because I haven't taken into, something into consideration that I didn't even think about, right? So working closely with our people business partners, working closely with legal, even when it comes to different things like employment law and how like decisions we might make have an impact there on policies,
yeah,
tax when it comes to mobility,
for
right?
sure, yeah.
Yeah, there's so many different elements where it touches on immigration and mobility. So communication is going to be key, whether that is like a one-on-one or that's a stand-up, or it's just a Slack thread, right? It's saying, hey, this is what's going on. I need you to like just read through this, get your feedback. I need to know if I'm missing anything from your world, and make sure we're building right from the beginning.
This can all feel really dizzying when you have to have multiple conversations, perhaps about, the same issue with tax, legal, business partners, HRBPs. How do you keep track of it all? Like what do you do to sort of stay centered with, your mission of compliance, world-class service, empathy, while balancing, 10 conversations you might be having in the background just to help maybe one case?
So yes, that is the struggle. That is the problem, keeping track of all of that, but also not wanting to build for just one case. You want to build something that has some level of standardization across it and exceptions truly to be exceptions and not become a norm. It's a struggle, but when I think about one, like compliance is important, right? And even if your company has a healthy risk appetite in certain areas, I see it as my job of being able to say like, well, here are the consequences if we don't do XYZ, right? So compliance from that standpoint, from an empathy standpoint, I'm lucky to work with incredible people who I think also lead with the same. We want the best for our employees. We want them to have the best experience possible. We wouldn't bother to go through, the resources and the time that it requires to go through something like, a mobility assignment if we didn't want the best for them. So I think that's not a hard sell, I think, for everyone to have in mind as we're making those decisions. And then from adaptability, it's, where are we using the flexibility within this policy or this guide versus where are we kind of just realizing that this doesn't fit what we need. And then that's now a roadblock, or that's a challenge that I have to work around, right? I have to listen into the business and say, okay, well, what went wrong here? What changed? And then how do we work around it in the future? How do we build to account for this?
I bet just the way you're approaching it and when I hear sort of the other stakeholders, it sounds like that empathy and the way you're communicating with your foreign national employees, even if you don't have an immediate answer, I feel like that would get across because it's so important. Like, hey, here's where we're going. Here's the 6 conversations we have to have before we can place you, or why the timeline's impacted. And I think that's such a big deal to sort of communicate the process when you're talking about transparency. Often that's the piece that gets missed. I think when, especially I'm talking with folks in the industry, they're like, okay, how do you communicate milestones? It's like, sure, you can communicate milestones like, hey, we're initiating, hey, we're filed. But there's like so much stuff that can happen in between
Yeah.
that can really, go astray, whether it's the companies in control of that or not, like with government processing times, but even just sort of saying like, here's what we're going through. And then people really feel like you're bringing them along as a partner. And that's what I hear you describing as sort of, that's what the transparency process is like, the context along the way. And then that also is showing empathy in the sense that you're like, here's where we're going. It's actually like a million touch points when you kind of think about it.
100%. Yeah. And I think there's also a lot of opportunity to really empower people in these processes. I mean,
Okay.
think about immigration, right? I think for a lot of folks, there's an element of vulnerability when you're on
Yeah.
a visa.
Yeah.
I've been in those shoes before, and I definitely felt it. Right? There's
Yeah.
a level of I don't control aspects of this, and there's real life impact if something goes wrong.
Yeah.
And so I think when you are very transparent, when you communicate, when you don't try to hide where there are
Right.
risks, right? You just be upfront. You just say, this is what we're up against. This is what we're going to do to combat it or to mitigate it. And also provide, feedback from them on it of like, if we're pursuing a green card application, for instance, and that green card application is maybe not as strong as we want it to be, and we're
Right.
maybe hesitant, getting that feedback from that individual, if the business is willing to move forward, do you want us to move forward? Like there's empowerment in just communicating.
Yeah.
Of, like you said, bringing them along for the journey and not just kind of dragging along and saying, oh no, we've got it, right?
Right.
Like they should know what's going on in their
Yeah.
cases.
I would tell you when I first started practicing, I very much put we got this, like, just trust me. And because I was scared to have the vulnerable conversations of like, hey, here's worst case scenario. Like I hated talking about worst case scenario. Like I dreaded having to answer that question. And now as I'm training up junior associates or other partners, I sort of say like, we're going to talk about it all and ask me that worst case scenario question. Cause then we just know it's like all on the table. I don't know about you. Did you have a journey sort of getting to the point you're at? Because when you're talking about vulnerability in these conversations, I imagine that wasn't you on day one. Or if it was, like, you're super special. What was that journey like?
Yeah, no, definitely not a day one thing. I think that
Okay.
comes with close to 15 years of
Okay.
experience.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said at the top of the call, I think the experience that I had working in the immigration law firms really kind of gave me a lot of knowledge, gave me a lot of experience, but it kind of instilled that empathy in me.
Mhm.
Because I touched, oh God, it must be a thousand different cases, right? I touched a thousand
Sure.
different cases, got to really know the clients I was working with, whether they were clients of, companies and it was, employer-based green card and H-1Bs, which sometimes were standard versus looking in like family class applications where you're talking about marriage base, or, individual pursuit for permanent residency in different countries. And I'm talking US, Canada, other countries as well. The experience is often very similar where it's just, I don't know what's going on. I'm scared because, I want to be there, or I am here and I want to stay here. My family's here. I've built a life. And I think that experience of really being along for the journey from like the opening of a case all the way to whatever that resolution is at the end, really opened my eyes to the work that's being done is important and it's impactful. And that needs to be treated with respect and care. And that translates the same when you're in house, right? Employees, whether they are C suite level and are on a visa, there's still vulnerability, right? There's
Yeah.
still that like, this needs to be sorted because I have a life here. And you treat that with care and you treat that with respect. And I think that comes with that transparency and that comes with communicating from the beginning, even when the conversation's hard.
And as an in-house professional leading the program, you're even one step closer to the employees, right? You see them daily. Maybe you're in the office or you're communicating with them for other projects, or you see what they're doing for the company.
Yep.
So if anything, it's like way more personal to make,
100%.
to connect. And when you can't control everything, because some things just aren't in our control, you feel probably even more connected to making sure that that conversation goes well. Or you could run away from it, but sounds like you're not.
Would not be good to run away from
No,
it.
I
But
know.
yeah, for sure. These are my colleagues.
Yeah,
These are colleagues. These are folks that, outside of just immigration, like getting to know them as people, getting to know them as, professionals in their own areas, and a tremendous amount of respect. So yeah, of course, I'm going to want to make sure I'm putting my best foot forward, and I want to make sure that our vendors are doing that as well for them, and,
totally.
and
Yeah,
be
then you're
be their be their advocate.
yeah,
That's what I see.
love that. What are your main priorities going into 2025? We touched a little bit on the election and whether that's, part of your priorities for 2025. Can you speak to what you're looking forward to, what you're focused on for the year ahead?
I mean, look, when it comes to the election, um, I think there's only so much we can do right now,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Because even, previously, I think being in this space for as long as we have, with different administration, there's sometimes a lot of talk, but then not a lot of action that ends up, coming out of it. Um, so on that end, it's mostly just listening and waiting, right? But I think I'd say overall, the number one priority for the program is to enable and support Whatnot's growth as a business at the end of
Got
the
it.
day.
That's
That's the
exciting.
number one. Yeah, that's the number one priority. So thinking about mobility solutions as, key levers for quickly and effectively expanding and sharing legacy knowledge and company culture in new countries that we move into, while our immigration program also allows for the attraction and retention of key talent. So that's priority number one. And then, in order to achieve that and to achieve that support for company growth, I mentioned it earlier, but it's continuing to listen to the business
Yeah.
as a customer, right? And I think anyone who's worked in a startup or a hypergrowth company would likely tell you that it's rarely ever the same company for an extended period of time, right? So
Oh, sure.
I've been here,
Yeah.
yeah, I've been here for 2 years. I feel like I've worked at 4 different companies,
Wow.
um, which is it's incredibly exciting. Things are
Sure.
always
Yeah.
changing and moving, but it also means that we need to have the solutions that keep up with those
Yeah.
changing business needs. So there's definitely a necessity to listen closely to the business, be a strategic partner to understand those needs, and then iterate where necessary to make sure we're meeting the business where it is and ultimately where it wants to be.
Amazing. I loved what you said when, the priorities you said is growth as a business and that mobility being like a lever for that solution, driving growth in new countries. I don't think I've heard that yet from guests or folks I've talked to in the industry. The way you articulated was really sharp, and I love that. I feel like we could do a whole nother episode on that. So I'll probably circle back with you on 2025 and and what you're doing there because, yeah, like when the company is growing like gangbusters, getting the right people in the right places to support that company growth is critical. And like you're in that role leading that. So, you're in the room with these decisions when the business is growing. How cool. Amazing. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that that is really exciting for you in 2025 and can't wait to hear how that rolls out for you and what processes and you're iterating on that you roll out. So cool. I think we're kind of wrapping up here with some of the questions I had, but looking ahead, Liz, where do you see Whatnot's mobility program in the coming years? You've got the priorities for 2025. What would you say you're looking forward to in leading the immigration and mobility program?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly exciting to see the program growing in step with the company as we move into other countries, as we, just grow our headcount, grow our population. That's definitely proportional what I'm seeing in the program. So, I mean, in terms of, the team, right now it's myself. I'd expect, at some point down the line there to be growth on my team just to continue to, be able to efficiently support the business. But hard to say when that's going to be. But I mean, in terms of the program right now, there's a general feeling at Whatnot, and I feel like the program as well, just sky's the limit. There's really exciting things happening here and a tremendous amount of opportunity. So yeah, I don't know, I'm just really excited to hear. I'm thrilled to be along for the ride and honestly see where we end up.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you for describing just what it takes to sort of manage a program in this explosive growth stage. And I love the way you articulated your goals for the program and the way you lead through compliance, world-class service, adaptability, transparency. It's huge. I think those themes I'd love to dig into more and hear more about your expansion in 2025 and where the team is in a year's time. So we'll be sure to keep up the conversation. Thanks so much for sharing your time and expertise with us here on the Business Immigration Benchmark, Liz. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be back in the future.